everyone. And thank you all very much for joining us for this panel discussion. You're very welcome, and we have a real treat in store for you this afternoon. This is one of a series of local events running this week in connection with the Right Here, Right Now Global Summit on Climate Change and Human Rights. And this afternoon, we're asking, how can deliberative democracy support effective and just climate policy? My name's Alison Chisholm. I'm a researcher in the primary care department here at Oxford University and also a research associate at the Global Centre on Healthcare and Urbanisation. I've been involved in 3 deliberative democratic processes in the last few years, and seeing them close up has given me a real confidence that if they're done well, they can really play a role in helping contribute to building just climate policy and action. A climate justice lens recognises that the people hit first and hit hardest by the impacts of climate change are often those who have least responsibility for the emissions that are causing it, have benefited least from the burning of the fossil fuels, and also are often least resourced materially, at least, to adapt and respond to these impacts. So the injustices of the climate crisis are glaring. So we need to find ways forward that prioritise and involve the people who are most affected. And these ways need to be not only technical and physical, although those are really important, and we definitely need them, but also social and political ways forward that I would say need to attend to 3 things. First, we know that the transition to a low carbon economy requires changes to fundamental aspects of our lives, to what we eat, how we travel, our built environment, to our homes and where we work. And so to build public consent for this collective climate action, it needs to be very sensitive to real people's circumstances and needs and priorities and values, and it's really important that it feels fair. And to achieve this, we need meaningful public engagement in agreeing ways forward. Without this, we know, as we've seen, that we can encounter reluctance to adopt measures. There'll be resistance to them, we'll see backlash, and it can also lead to polarisation. Second, we know that climate impacts will challenge our already stressed social and economic systems. So we need solutions that can foster social cohesion and nurture resilient communities that can respond well to the destabilising forces of climate change. And third, we need to do it in ways that are equitable. So our systems need to listen carefully to and shift power towards those who are often not at the decision-making table. And I'm hopeful that these 3 goals are things that deliberative democracy can help advance. So we're very fortunate, and I'm genuinely really excited by the panel that we have this afternoon. We've got 5 wonderful speakers who are going to bring their perspectives on what deliberative democracy is and some of the ways it manifests at local, national and global scales. We'll hear about the opportunities it presents, as well as some of the challenges and unknowns. So thank you very much to all our speakers for joining us today. Here's one now. Hi, Tim. Welcome. So shortly we'll hear from Alan Renwick, who is Professor of Politics and Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit at UCL. He has extensive experiences of supporting, implementing and studying citizens' assemblies at local and national levels. Lucy Farrow is one of the UK's leading deliberative research and engagement practitioners with 15 years experience involving citizens in the decisions that affect their lives. She's a partner at Thinks and a visiting fellow at Lancaster University, and may say more by way of introduction when she comes up. Reema Patel is a practitioner and thought leader in the field of deliberative democracy. She's establishing the Global Citizens Assembly in 2025 with the ISRE Foundation, and she directed the Global Science Partnership for COP26. Tim Schwanen is Professor of Transport Geography and Director of the Transport Studies Unit in the School of Geography at the University of Oxford. Among many other things, he is a seasoned Citizens Assembly commentator and advisory board member. And last, but absolutely not least, I'm really happy that we'll hear from Kris Masih, Kris is an Oxford resident who brings her first-hand experience of taking part in deliberative democratic processes as a Citizens' Assembly member. So she can speak to what it feels like to be involved in one of these processes. We'll now hear a short talk from each of our panellists who are going to speak in the order on the slide there. And then I will ask them one or two questions before I open it up to the floor for your questions. And I look forward to a really great discussion. Over to you, Professor Alan Renwick.
Thank you so much, Alison. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for organising this event. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and looking forward to hearing your questions as well. So Alison asked me to give a bit of an introduction to deliberative democracy. I'm sure many of you have come here because you know lots about deliberative democracy already, but some of you might be a little bit hazy on some of the details. So it'd be useful to give a little bit of an introduction. So I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, what actually is deliberative democracy, then how might it help support effective and just climate change, just give some introductory thoughts on that, and then also what potential pitfalls should we be aware of when we're thinking about the potential effects of such processes. So what is deliberative democracy? Well, one can start very basically making progress in the direction of understanding that by saying, well, it's democracy based on deliberation, but clearly there are two big and difficult words there that we need to get our heads around. So just very quickly, I will define democracy as being a system of decision-making by and for all the people. Fairly standard way of thinking about democracy, and that encompasses both direct decision-making by the people on particular policy decisions, and also indirect democracy, where voters are choosing representatives who then make the decisions on particular policy issues. While deliberation is a process of, as it says, they're carefully weighing different views and pieces of evidence before drawing conclusions. So crucially, in a process of deliberation, we enter the discussion with open minds. It's not that we necessarily enter the discussion without views on the subject. We may well already have views, but we don't go into the discussion simply with the intention of securing victory for our side of the argument, as often would take place in a debate. Rather, in a deliberative process, we're going in there ready to listen, ready to hear different perspectives, ready to look at evidence and weigh different bits of evidence and different arguments and so on, and come to a conclusion on that basis. In order to think about this, it's often useful to think about, well, what are the alternatives to deliberative democracy? So here's just one very quick way of thinking about that, building on those two dimensions of democracy and deliberation that I've already mentioned. So we can answer yes or no to the question of whether there's democracy, so are decisions made directly or indirectly by the public? And we can answer yes or no to the question of whether there's deliberation, are decisions based on deliberation? So if we answer yes to both of those questions, then we're in the realm of deliberative democracy, as I've just defined it. Is if we say yes to democracy, that decisions being made by the public, but no to deliberation, then it kind of feels like a lot of how politics actually works in practice. Kind of certainly looks as though decisions are often made through a process of lots of politicians shouting at each other and arguing past each other, and that doesn't feel like there's a lot of listening going on. Maybe there's a bit more listening actually going on behind the scenes, but it often doesn't feel that way. I've called it their populist democracy because that's certainly a particular version of democracy that fits into that corner. So populists tend to think there are fairly simple solutions, that there are fairly obvious solutions to problems, that it's just that the evil, corrupt elite are getting in the way of the public being able to implement the will of the public, and that we don't need much debate and much deliberation around difficult trade-offs or anything like that. Answers are simple from a populist perspective. We can also have a situation where decisions are based on deliberation, so we have yes to that question, but the public are not involved. So an example of that would be technocratic decision-making, where experts essentially are potentially engaging in much deliberation among themselves. So they're looking at the evidence carefully, they're weighing that before coming to conclusions, but they're not necessarily engaging the wider public and may therefore not really understand what makes people tick in a wider sense. And then if we answer no to both of the questions, then we might be in a world of autarky where we have decision-making based on the whims of a single leader, essentially, and wider consultation or deeper consultation, neither of those taking place. So that's the theory. What in practice does such deliberative democracy look like? Well, it can take many, many forms. So, for example, a parliament can be a deliberative institution. And much of the work that Parliament does, at least behind the scenes in committees and so on, can have some deliberative quality to it. But when we look at the most high-profile bits of Parliament's work, if we think about Prime Minister's questions, for example, that does not feel very deliberative at all. And when we talk about deliberative democracy, often instead we're referring to rather different processes where members of the public are directly involved in deliberating and discussing policy questions. So this is a picture of a citizens' assembly. Again, many of you will be familiar with citizens' assemblies, some of you perhaps less so. So this, in fact, was the Climate Assembly UK, which met in 2020 in order to consider the question of how the UK should achieve its net zero 2050 target. So a citizens' assembly is a process where a representative sample of the population is brought together through quite a careful process of recruitment. They come together over a period typically of several weekends. So the Climate Assembly originally was intended to meet for 4 weekends. COVID happened in the middle, so they moved online and it got a little bit messier towards the end, but that was the basic idea. And they discuss among themselves a great deal. And you can see here a lot of the discussions take place in round tables with maybe 7 or 8 people per table and a facilitator on each table. They're the people in the blue t-shirts, making sure the conversation remains on track. And so a lot of the time is the members learning from each other, discovering different perspectives among each other, discovering that perhaps people with different perspectives aren't necessarily terrible people, that they have legitimate perspectives. They also hear from experts. So the Climate Assembly heard from David Attenborough, whom of course we all know. I'm guessing some people in this audience will also recognize Chris Stark on the right, who at the time was the CEO of the Climate Change Committee, now the head of the UK government's climate mission. And he was deeply involved in making sure that there was good evidence for the Climate Assembly in this process. So there will be a range of different experts. It's very important to get a range of different perspectives in. They will give short presentations. The members will discuss among themselves what questions they want to put to the experts. And what you see here is a Q&A session where the members of the assembly have thought about their questions and those questions are being put to the experts and the experts are responding. Then the members reflect further, deliberate further, ask further questions and so on. And eventually through that process, they make recommendations on the question that has been put to the assembly. And those, in this case, went in a very big, thick report that came out of the Climate Assembly, setting out a range of recommendations and the reasoning underpinning. So, very quickly, how might deliberative democracy help support effective and just climate policy? Just some initial ideas on this, and I'm sure we'll hear much more from the other panelists. But so going back to this little table that I had, again, it's quite useful to think about, well, what are the sorts of deficits in other forms of politics that deliberative democracy might try to tackle? So when we're looking at populist democracy, democracy as often it feels like it exists at present, one concern is that it can be very short-termist, can have very short time horizons. Politicians are often focused on the next headline or the next election, whereas climate policy clearly needs longer time horizons. So hopefully deliberative processes might enable a lengthening of those time horizons. Populist democracy, or democracy as we know it, often also feels rather dominated by vested interests, powerful vested interests, perhaps interests that are able to dominate the discussion in the media. And again, deliberative processes are hopefully able to ensure a more equitable balance of different voices so that more excluded voices are able to come in to a greater degree. Then if we think about technocracy, and what might be the deficits that we see with technocracy, then so there, okay, fine, the technocrats, the experts may be able to come up with technically very fine solutions, but if those don't take account of the complexity of people's lives and the diversity of people's experiences and lives and perspectives across the country, then you may not get solutions that really work on the ground, and indeed those solutions may not be perceived as fair. As Alison was pointing out, that concept of fairness is often really central to discussions in citizens' assemblies. So getting something that people can feel is fair and reasonable and justified, often you can get further with that through a citizens' assembly process. So I would highlight those 4 things as at least initial headlines to get us going and thinking about what deliberative democracy might be able to provide, and building on those points that I have just made. We should also be aware of some pitfalls, however, and some dangers with these processes, and question whether they're always going to fulfill their potential as we might hope. So one difficulty is that running these processes well is hard. It's essential to do them well, and it's hard to do them well. So I've done many of these processes in various different capacities, and I've seen them often, the citizens' assemblies in themselves do work fantastically well, but that requires a huge amount of work and energy and expertise and resources that often are not as available as we might hope. So that can be a difficulty. There can be a temptation to cut corners. Even if the process in itself works well, how it then interacts with the wider political system, given that the final decision makers are not the members of the assembly, but are elected politicians who are accountable to voters, that can be very difficult. So decision makers need to take recommendations from deliberative processes seriously. They don't necessarily need to agree. Citizens' assembly members tend to understand that it's fine if the politicians take the recommendations seriously, but then come to the conclusion that actually something different would be better. But the recommendations need to be taken seriously, and sometimes that does not happen. So sometimes decision makers might convene these kinds of processes in order to look like they're engaging with public opinion, but not actually take the outputs very seriously. Sometimes there can be a temptation to use one of these processes in order to legitimize decisions that basically have already been made, in which case there might be cherry picking of recommendations rather than looking across the board. So there are real dangers there. And that very much links up to a third and final point, which is that if the wider political milieu in which a citizens' assembly is located is not in itself deliberative, then the danger is that this citizens' assembly just turns into a political football, and it's just kicked around by proponents and opponents of different perspectives. So people who don't like the recommendations of the assembly will say that it was unrepresentative, or that the members were brainwashed by the organizers, and it can be quite hard for defenders of the process to defend it effectively, even if those accusations are not at all well grounded. So that can be a concern. So overall, my conclusion, very briefly, would be that the potential of these processes is really great, but realizing that potential, realizing the potential of deliberative democracy requires not just doing isolated citizens' assemblies, but really trying to shift our political culture, making the wider culture of politics more deliberative, more receptive to these kinds of ways of doing politics. And if we did that, then hopefully we would be able to fulfill the ambition expressed by the question. Thank you very much.
All right, that's the aspiration. That's the aspiration. All right, hello, thank you. I just want to say I'm really relieved by your conclusion, Alison, because it makes mine seem a little bit less surprising. And I wrote them and then I felt nervous about them, so we'll see. So my name's Lucy. I have 2 jobs. One is that I run a team of practitioners who deliver citizens' assemblies, juries, similar kinds of processes on all kinds of topics. And then my other job is that I am part of a research group at a university that research specifically climate and how policy making can be made with citizens in climate. It's called Climate Citizens. So I'm going to talk a little bit from each of those hats today, and hopefully that gives you a bit of some climate perspective, also with some lessons from other kinds of processes. So the question we were asked was how can these types of processes help to make effective and fair climate policy? I'm going to start by saying that I think we should stop doing climate assemblies. You'll see why I feel better after your conclusion, Alan. I wrote it and it looks good, and that's a very big screen. And when I saw it up there, I thought, ooh, all right. Now that might seem a strange thing for somebody whose job it is, who gets paid to run these kinds of processes, to say. But I think it's actually really important that we think about what are climate assemblies for, what is the job that they are doing, where are we right now, and this is with my climate hat on, where are we in our journey towards an effective response to climate change? And I would argue that we are at a point at which we should be less concerned with the what and more concerned with the how. We should be concerned not with whether we have a mandate for climate action, but how we can achieve the types of climate action and the pace that we need in order to meaningfully respond to the level of climate threat that we face. So I would argue that climate assemblies have done a wonderful job of getting us to a place where we can start thinking about how, and now we should start thinking about what's next. Helpfully, my colleagues at Climate Citizens in Lancaster have just done a really lovely summary of all of the UK's climate. They call them DMPs, deliberative mini-publics. It's jargon, means the same thing, climate assembly type thing. We have done quite a lot of them now. There have been 30 deliberative mini-publics, climate assemblies in the UK in different locations at different scales over the last few years. That's 47,000 hours of deliberation. That's just a really pleasing number to say. So we've done quite a lot of this. We haven't done them everywhere, but we have done them in a wide range of places, urban, rural. We've done them in different kinds of local authorities, left-wing, right-wing. We've done them on different questions, some more specific and some more general. And the other thing that this work that the Climate Citizens team have done, which I highly recommend, is to show that there's actually a lot of consistency in what is recommended. So people want action on climate and they support ambitious policies. They want better public communication and education on climate change. That comes up all the time. People, 99 times out of 100, come out of these processes and say, I wish everybody could have the same level of understanding that I have from this. That comes through really strongly. And we also hear that it's not just about finance, it's also about having the information to make good choices as a consumer. That's one of the most important recommendations we hear, is that people want support to make good choices. And most often, those recommendations are around transport and around housing. Those are two really big areas, around things like retrofit, making transport more accessible and affordable. I know we've got transport-specific speaker up next. So the recommendations that are really consistent. But most of those recommendations are not policy. Make transport more affordable is not a policy in and of itself. It is a policy aspiration, but the actual work of making that happen through funding allocations across regions, through the system by which our bus companies are franchised, that is policy. And that is not something that we have, as yet, done an assembly on. And it might not be a very good thing to do an assembly on. It might be something that we need to do deliberatively and with a diverse group of people and in a way that is democratic, but a citizens' assembly might not be quite the right tool. The other thing I would say is that these recommendations aren't climate action either. They are pointers, signposts. And most people haven't heard of them. Even Climate Assembly, even David Attenborough, only got something like, at the height of Climate Assembly, less than 50% of the population had heard of it. It's not something that people are seeing and calling for their local politicians to hark back to and respect. So I think there are some challenges. We've done a lot of work, we've done some good work, we've moved the conversation forward, but I think we need to think about what's next. And there are 3 types of deliberative engagement that I think are what we should be doing next. One is real policy making. That's an abacus. You have to choose icons for things. That's an abacus because real policy making is complicated and involves lots of technical things like modelling. I'm super interested in modelling. I'm interested in transport models and economic models and energy demand models and all of the clever computer maths modelly. You can tell I'm not a quant. All of the things that policymakers go away, and when a politician says make bus fares cheaper, They use a transport model and an economic model and a regional development model to try and predict what will happen economically. How are those built? Where is the deliberation and the democracy in those technocratic processes? That's the bit of policy making that in an assembly which makes a recommendation, Alan said, deliberation needs to happen in the whole milieu, not just in the room. That's the thing that's interesting to me. How do we get people into that? I'll give you an example in a minute. Legitimate decision making. I told you that the climate assembly was not something that everybody had heard about. If we think that engaging people in making policy is a way of making that policy more acceptable, if we think there's some process of signalling by which a decision that's made by our peers is more acceptable to us, then people have to receive the signal. So I think there's a big challenge in how widely and how well we're doing at signalling that process, those processes and that legitimacy. And then something Alison said about resilience, I think is really interesting. I think there's also a really interesting role for these types of processes in building stronger democracy, not just in the big picture theoretical sense, but in the practical sense of communities that are resilient, where people have agency and people have a clear sense of how they can control their environment, which is something that climate threatens. That's the whole point of climate breakdown, is that our environment is out of our control now. So building resilience. I'm going to give you 3 examples of things that programs that I think do this. The first is the Climate Change Committee, who are always doing good stuff. They ran some panel work on net zero, and this work very specifically involved people in testing their energy demand model. An energy demand model is a way of trying to predict how much energy, electricity, gas, how much will we need in future. And that is affected by all kinds of things, like how hot it is, how much we need heating and cooling. It is affected by choices we make. How many electric cars versus petrol cars are on the road feeds our energy demand models. And out the other end, it comes with a number. And then the national grid has to supply that number in the short term, but also in the long term. So that demand model is one of the most important tools that government uses to make policy. And it is, to use Alan's language, absolutely technocratic. It is built by technocrats. So what the Climate Change Committee did was they tried to, and I think did quite a good job of, trying to get people into that model. They built a deliberative process with a representative group of people. They informed them. They showed them as much as they could about how this model worked. And I asked them, does this make sense? Are these plausible? Are these pathways where we're saying, 30% of people will change their energy use in this way or that way? Does that make sense? Is that consistent with the people you know, with the places you live, with the things that are possible in your lives? So when we get to that question of distribution and distributional justice, which again Alison touched on, this idea of what's fair and who wins and who loses, I think the questions that we need to be asking are at that level of what is it that we actually, what is our actual policy making? What are the levers that we pull? Where do we put prices up or down? Where do we invest now? And what does the consequence of that in terms of the climate impact? So that's an example of doing something that looks very different from an assembly. It's actually not necessary to some extent that we know about this. It's nice that we do, but it doesn't rely on it. It's not a process of public democracy, but it is a process of policy making in a more deliberative way. I think that's one of the things that if we want to get past some of the really sticky challenges and of climate, and we want to do that in a way that really considers distributional justice and making sure that there aren't winners and losers and that we don't entrench existing inequalities, then bringing diverse groups of people into our technical policy making is one of the things that we should use deliberative democracy for. The second thing I said is that if deliberative democracy helps people to feel that policy is legitimate in some way, then people have to know about it. This is my other hat now. It's not my climate hat. This is my other hat. Did anybody respond to the consultation about the future of the NHS last year? It'd be really helpful if some of you had. Yeah, 1, hooray! Do you know what? That's not bad, because approximately 1 in 60 people in England had some kind of contribution to this consultation about the future of the NHS. Now, is it perfect? Will the Labour government make a brilliant plan and fix the NHS tomorrow? I don't know. Not in my gift. But if we're interested in policy making that feels public and feels genuinely democratic in a different way to the ballot box, then I think that is the level of ambition we need to have about telling people about deliberative democracy. So I'm not saying that this is deliberative democracy. Actually, it was a quite, in many elements of it were quite kind of classical consultations, right? There was a form and you filled it in. There was also some very deep deliberation, some work with communities, some work with staff in the NHS. But if we think about how do we get people to the sense that climate policy is being made with them, we have to tell them about it. And so for me, one of the things that has been missing from deliberative democracy and climate so far, and which we should be thinking about, is how do we make it available to people and make people aware of it in a way that is ideally interesting. And that would help if people wanted to hear about it. But that would make that legitimacy signaling effect real, right? We theorize about it all the time. There's loads of theoretical stuff that says if you make policies in this way, people will accept difficult trade-offs. And that might well be true, but only if they know about it. So that's one of the things that I think we should be thinking about how we do deliberative democracy in a much bigger, showier way. And then the last thing is this idea of deliberative democracy is contributing to a stronger democracy, to resilience, to the kinds of communities that are self-sufficient, that have agency. And my favorite stat is that according to the World Health Organization, loneliness is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I really miss smoking, so that's really hits home for me. If we think about what kinds of communities we need in order to be resilient to climate breakdown, they are communities that have agency, that can respond to things that are unpredictable. And part of when deliberative democracy works well is it helps people to cement the tools to do that. We practice and model in those rooms or those assemblies conversations in which we listen to each other and we maybe change our minds. And we do that in a way that considers evidence and reason. And so the best deliberative processes, this is some work by an organisation called Shared Future, who are brilliant. They've been doing lots of work in the Northwest. They ran a climate jury in Preston. The people who were in that jury, and I love that we have someone from a Citizens Assembly here today, some of those people have now gone on and they're wearing their climate jury volunteer t-shirts. They're running local events to get more people involved. There's a sense in which we don't just stop in the room, but equally we don't just stop in the room and give the recommendations to government to do. What we should be doing is seeing these as places in which we practice doing local democracy, not politics, because I don't think those two are the same thing. I think local democracy in the sense of local decision-making, local action. I think that the kinds of processes that we need to build a resilient society that can stand up to climate change are also processes in which people have those same skills of being able to deliberate and reason together and come to shared conclusions and explore trade-offs. So if we were to do more of that kind of deliberation, I think that's the other thing that we need for climate. And that's a different kind of angle on justice as well. It's not just about distribution. It's not just a kind of view of fairness that says, is anybody being badly treated? It's not a kind of negative conceptualization of fairness. It's one that says fairness and equity and justice all go together and are part of a kind of reciprocal relationship. And that's the other thing that deliberative democracy can do. It can help us to build relationships which are stronger and more resilient. And that's the other thing I'd like to do. So that was my attempt to answer the question of how can deliberative democracy support effective and just climate policy in those ways. Thank you very much. Sorry, I should have introduced you, Reema. No, I didn't introduce myself.
Hi everyone, my name is Reema Patel. I'm a long-standing practitioner in the field of deliberative democracy, and I have a small claim to fame, if I may share it, which is in 2018 I ran something called the Citizens Economic Council based at the RSA, and I published a report called Building a Public Culture of Economics, and someone dropped me an email and told me that a campaign group that I'd never heard of before was quite interested in this sort of idea of deliberative democracy, and it turned out the name of that campaign group was Extinction Rebellion, and so I'm really, I've never actually shared that in public before, but in terms of the sort of my connection with climate, I kind of came through it through my interest in economics, it's just really interesting to sort of think about how far we've come in that time period. So I've worked on establishing the Citizens Economic Council, ran numerous public dialogues on things like net zero future, and also on the Committee on Climate Change panel. That's already been mentioned, so I was involved in delivering that, and have been involved in a number of local citizen assembly. I was a local councillor and made the case within the council group for Barnet to run a citizens assembly as well. So these are all sort of different types of interactions that I've had with citizen assemblies, both as a practitioner, but more importantly as a member of the public myself. And my project at the moment is working with the ISWE Foundation to run a global citizens assembly on climate, again, on food system. The important thing here is that it's not just about climate. The goal is to establish a permanent institution, coming back to this key point which has come up, which is it's not just about these one-off events. What we need is a fundamental change in culture, in outcomes, in action. So this initiative will speak to that. And it's kind of an exploration of some of the key themes and questions that are coming up. And hopefully an answer to the question that you're asking, which is about the role of deliberative democracy in making climate action happen. So what is it? And it's quite important to sort of say it's not one thing, actually. So we're thinking about it as 4 components that work together, that are mutually reinforcing. A series of activating a series of community assembly that can be run anywhere by anyone. The core assembly, civic assembly, so a global deliberative mini-public that brings together over 100 people from across the world, a snapshot of the human family, a campaign. So actually there's something about not just doing these things, but communicating about what's actually happening, influencing change, and Lucy, spoke very well, I thought, to that. And then a coalition, so really thinking about how the civic infrastructure, these assemblies dock into global multilateral institutions and thinking about that relationship. So these 4 components are really critical to not just the execution of citizens' assembly or multiple citizens' assembly, but to enabling climate action to take place. And 1, 2, 3, 4 together are sort of, my provocation is that together we need these 4 components to make deliberative democracy, ensure that just and effective climate action happens at local, national and international level. Community assemblies, the idea here is that anyone on earth can participate. And so we have launched a platform called Assemblies, which allows anyone to run their own community assembly anywhere on earth, through community centres, libraries, schools, organisation and more. Currently that's being refined and tested with community partners in India, in Kenya, and also here in the UK with Community Organised UK. So community assemblies are about the same learning journey at the core, but over a time period that works for the community. And so the focus there is around stories, decisions, data, action plan. There are some guiding materials on how to run a community assembly if you're interested in that, but essentially you can adapt that and evolve that in any way you'd like to do so. The sort of vision here is the sort of idea that the GCA activates people who are already having conversation about climate to have the tools and the confidence to make fair and effective decisions, and through being able to run their own inclusive community assembly, facilitating learning, building solidarity and enabling local and global action. So our proposition really is that for this to actually make meaningful change happen, anyone needs to feel that they are able to do it. And that's kind of an interesting provocation. Not everyone necessarily would agree with that, but I think that that's a kind of a core position there. So there's guidance resources, peer network and channel of influence, data for communities and data for the world is also something that we're thinking about, which is what emerges from these assemblies and how do we kind of ensure that anyone who wants to make use of what emerges from these assemblies is able to do so. So through the idea or the concept of data governance, collective data commons and stewardship. So that's just an image of the platform, but if anyone's interested, I can share more about that through Alison. Yeah. In terms of the mini-public or the global civic assembly or assembly, I've already mentioned very much about bringing together a snapshot of the human family, descriptive and diverse by gender, age, education, views on climate and geography, chosen by a methodology called global sortitions, a civic lottery. And actually there's a really interesting question, which is how we do this internationally. In a local setting, people receive a letter because they're on electoral register. In an international setting, that's actually a really tricky challenge, and I've just published a blog post about that, if anyone is really interested in the detail of that. The other thing that we're really thinking about is this can't just be a nationally representative sample, because if it is, we would be at risk of excluding communities who live in places like the Maldives or the Seychelles where there's significant climate risk. So one of the things that we're thinking about relates to boosts in relation to lived experience of climate risks, and using the climate risk data sets in order to identify that diversity in that snapshot. I mentioned the importance of a campaign. So actually the Brazilian government, which is leading the COP30 agenda and is hosting COP30, have launched a call they call for a global mutirão, or the idea that there's a kind of collective shared vision for inclusion and action, climate action. So here they're really tapping into the idea that they alone cannot be the stewards of and enablers of effective climate action, that it needs to be a shared, common and collective effort. So this is about culture, movements, influences, and policy organisations working closely with national and local movement. The coalition, so I mentioned the role of the Brazilian government, the Brazilian government have announced their support and their backing for this initiative, and there's also a wide range of other organisations that have been really involved internationally in essentially calling for the establishment of the Global Citizens Assembly. And in terms of the sort of involvement of some of these organisations, some of them are partners on the ground, others are involved in institutionally making the case for what I like to call participatory multilateralism. So Alan was talking about technocracy, and the global governance landscape and conversation is a really interesting one, because there isn't really much of a space for citizens to have the ability to shape that. So obviously one of the things that we want to do is to change that, create some of those spaces and open them up. And the two sort of big moments that are obvious moments for that are certainly COP. That's a kind of moment that's been much critiqued in many ways for not really activating and including civil society organisation, but also emerging as quite significant in this conversation is the AI Action Summit. And actually there's a really interesting sort of strand around climate when it relates to AI and the uses of AI and AI climate intensity. So that's quite an interesting question. This initiative is not new, by the way. There was a version of it that ran in 2021. There's a really interesting network of academic researchers called GLOCAN that have been researching and thinking about what methodology for global assembly look like. Certainly we're working very hard in the run-up to COP30 in Brazil this year, but the end goal is very much a permanent GCA, a permanent Global Citizen Assembly for people and planet. And the idea is that this isn't necessarily just about climate, although climate is an obvious first issue. It can be in relation to any major global governance conversation. So really your key question is about impact. You want to know what impact deliberative democracy can have in resolving or resulting in just or fair climate outcomes. And so this is my last slide that really speaks to the types of impact that we think that the Global Citizen Assemblies and other initiatives like it can have. The first relates to institutional action. So when we're thinking about policy institution, the things they can do, whether that's creating incentives, governance, regulation, there's clearly institutional actions that government organisations can have. But there's also actions that happen on the ground by you and I. We can make change happen in our own different ways. We can choose to pursue outcomes or changes in our day-to-day life that result in just and effective climate change. Climate action. We can also work together. So there's something about the outcome of solidarity, a shared, collective, joint future. Deliberative democracy plays a really critical role in enabling those discussions between people who have different interests and stakes in outcome. There's also an impact of learning at scale. Actually, it's a really complicated area, and we don't all know an awful lot about it. So how do we learn more about, the way a food system works, or how they're experienced by different people, so that we understand the best ways to make climate action happen? And last, but certainly not least from my perspective, is equity and inclusion. The reason I got involved in this work was because I felt that climate action and all these other sorts of outcomes were not adequately really thinking about the distributional impact on different groups and community. If we can create a space in which people can understand more about what those distributional impacts are, we're actually more likely to have policies and interventions and solutions and action that are aligned with the needs of people in the short term, medium term, and long term. So, yeah, thank you very much for a really stimulating conversation, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. Wow.
So thank you for having me. No slides from me. I'll just talk, and I'll bring it back to the UK and to the local level, because I want to talk about my experience as someone who is regularly asked as an expert to give evidence as part of citizen assemblies. So what do I make of citizen assemblies as a tool in relation to creating just transitions? And I would say I'm mostly positive about this, but there is some ambiguity, and I'll try to work through why that is. For me, the key reason for optimism is that citizen assemblies are relatively well placed to contribute to what is known as cognitive justice. Cognitive justice is a concept that comes from post-colonial scholarship, and it is really about how we treat different knowledge systems. Originally, this comes from research in India, where sort of traditional Western medicine versus indigenous forms of medicine were kind of never treated as sort of equally, and cognitive justice is like sort of really allowing different knowledge systems to be taken seriously and to be engaged with constructively with an open mind. And I think citizen assembly is actually quite good at doing something similar. And particularly in a field like transport where I work, this is important because this is a field that traditionally is characterized, certainly in the UK, by quite technocratic knowledge, top-down forms of planning, very modeling heavy. And perhaps I don't quite share your optimism about modeling, because I think it's very, very partial, which always gets hidden under a cloak of objectivity and scientific rigor. So citizen assemblies allow us to pry open the dominance of those forms of knowledge and kind of bring in different types of knowledge and understanding. And they also change the role for the scientists. They turn me in a different type of expert. So I am not, or no longer, a neutral arbiter who can bring valueless truths with a capital T. That position, I am very glad to leave behind, because it's a position that is not available to me because of the epistemological, ontological commitments that I work with. As a social scientist, as a scholar, I've been in sort of my own academic training and career deeply influenced by thinking from feminism, from post-colonialism, science and technology studies, anthropological studies of how knowledge is created, how scientific knowledge is created. So I've become very, very wary of this idea that scientific knowledge is somehow super objective and neutral, and that we sort of really need to move move away from that and really start from a much more humble position about how all knowledge is partial, situated, and provisional. And that means that as a transport professor, if people ask me, what will happen if we do this? I can't give you an answer. Most of what I do is, I sometimes think of my work as, and my public engagement as managing disappointment, because we're not able to give you the kinds of answers that people want from us. And that also happens in a citizen assembly. People ask questions and I panic because I don't know what the answer is. So unlike other types of public engagement, a citizen assembly gives me much more opportunity first to explain that I don't know, and then secondly, explain why I don't know. And because there is more space, more time to elaborate certain points, certain positions. So to give you some examples, we've already talked about how questions of distributive justice are very important, fairness are very important. But as soon as you start to think about distributive justice in relation to, for instance, something like a congestion charge, the answers become immediately very, very complex. And it depends on what kind of distribution you're looking at, what kind of identities, and so on and so forth. So there's no straightforward answer. Often what we see, particularly when it comes to transport, is that people refer to places elsewhere where successes have been booked. And as an urban scholar, we call this process urban interreferencing. There's a number of cities that time and again get recycled as success stories. For transport, when we talk about bus rapid transit, it's always going to be Curitiba or Bogota, for instance. If we're talking about cycling, it's always going to be Copenhagen, Groningen, Amsterdam, and so on and so forth. And now when we had the Citizen Assembly here in Oxford around transport in central Oxfordshire, these processes are also ongoing, and people keep, of course, referring to Cambridge, always for Oxford a relevant comparator, but people also refer to Ghent as a city that in many ways is quite comparable to Oxford. But actually it's not, for very clear reasons. You cannot, I think, draw meaningful comparisons between the cities because the governance structure is very different, the political system is very different, the culture is quite different. So this, by sort of gently pushing back against these kinds of comparisons, you can actually start to get people to think about some of the things that often do not get talked about in relation to transport. How, for instance, questions of governance structures, so how, for instance, local government interacts with regional and national government, or questions of political cultures, questions of political will play out and how important they are. And that many of the things that we often think about is if you just build cycling infrastructure that is segregated, then people will by themselves start to cycle. Or if we just put in more of this technology, such and such will happen. We kind of can start to sort of complicate the narratives and the thinking around these kinds of things. And we have the space to do that. And the point is not to suggest that cycling infrastructure is unimportant or that you should not focus on, for instance, vehicle automation to realize certain objectives. It is to kind of get people to think about how the effects of these kinds of interventions always are mediated by cultural processes and particularly by existing habits in a place. Habits as kind of a second nature almost. And that once you start to think in this way, it becomes very difficult to predict and to sort of articulate confident expectations about what's going to happen. So what I try to do, or what I've tried to do in the citizen assemblies I've been part of is to get people to think more critically and to give them some resources to do so. And oftentimes, and I've been surprised by this, is that people are actually more open to it than we would expect. And I sometimes ask myself the question, would this also be the case if I wasn't the white, middle-aged, middle-class man that I am. But I think the fact that I am in this position gives me a certain space to kind of help to complicate how we think about what we sometimes call fast solutions to problems, the populism that Alan was referring to. So a climate assembly gives me more opportunity to communicate my knowledge and sort of convey some of the thinking in ways that other public engagement forms don't. But I also have concerns, and this comes back to something that Alan was talking about as well, and that's that the transformative potential of climate assemblies still needs to be taken forward in a context that is often characterized by technocratic practices, political opportunism, and certainly in the case of transport in Oxfordshire, blatant populism, where we've had quite antagonistic sort of debates around low traffic neighborhoods, zero emission zones, traffic filters, and other interventions. All of which have led, I think, to a crisis, maybe not a crisis, well, sort of serious, have raised serious questions about confidence in local government and a certain disenchantment with local government. So I don't think that climate assemblies as such are enough to make transitions socially just. There are limits to the external validity, even if they are internally very credible and valid. And I think we saw some of that happen with the climate assembly here in Oxford. And I actually liked Alan's sort of analogy of the football, because I think that is what happened in the aftermath of the assembly that we had here a couple of months ago. Then again, and I think this is an important point to end on, having done about 6 of them, I would say we're getting better at them. Maybe 6 is not a very good number, but I think we're getting better at embedding them in local policy processes. I think we have to remember that they are, at least in the UK, a relatively recent innovation, and we're still finding our feet on how to do them well and how to embed them in broader processes. So judgment about how effective they are should probably be deferred, perhaps as much as a decade. Until then, I think we should keep experimenting and learning about how we can make them one cog in the wider machine for making our cities and systems like transport better. Thank you very much.
My role, it says there I'm a Citizens Assembly member, so my role here today is to give you some idea of what it feels like to be involved in these kind of activities. I've been lucky enough to be involved in 2 separate assemblies of this nature, one in 2021 and one just this year, both on the subject of transport and health and community health in Oxford and Oxfordshire. A little bit about me. I have lived in Oxford for more than 40 years and I love this city. You would have to pay me a significant amount of money to live anywhere else. I enjoy it very much. I've raised 4 children here and found it a wonderful place to raise a family. So I'm invested in this place. And when opportunities like this came up, when I became aware of the first exercise, it was in fact the first time I'd ever heard of such a thing. I didn't realize these things existed. And it just seemed to me such a wonderful way to be involved in the democratic process and contribute to my community in a meaningful way, but without the longer term commitment of other types of volunteering. I have a busy job. I have 4 children. I have a needy cat. I've got all the things going on taking up my time. So these were great opportunities from my perspective. Being part of the second larger Citizens Assembly earlier this year was
a no-brainer for me. If the county council is committing time and money to gathering the views of its citizens, from my perspective, this can only be a good thing. So on the back of those two activities, there are four thoughts that I brought away with me that I would like to share with you. The first was, and interestingly, I've been listening to the people before me, and almost everything I now have to say has been touched on already. So I think that's a good thing. I think that means things are doing what they're meant to be doing. So that's very positive from my perspective. The first thing is that it is important that these processes bear fruit and have genuine impact. I tend to be a very optimistic person, very much a glass totally full and overflowing kind of human. But there is a little skeptic in my brain that worries that these things may just be for show, that they're about placating the public while the authorities carry on with whatever it is they had already planned to do anyway. For these kinds of investments to have any value, the voices must actually be heard. I don't think anyone goes into it as a citizen thinking, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to salute and do it. I mean, I don't think any of us think that, but the important thing is that when the process is done and we've delivered recommendations, we need to feel like we've been heard, that you've genuinely taken on board the things that we've said, understood the point of view, and put it into the mix of the decision making. The second thing is, and this surprised me a little, the ideas that came out of both exercises were surprisingly sensible and realistic. There was a lot of very, very, very blue sky thinking at the beginning of both processes. But as we learned more and as we talked more and discussed more and understood more, our recommendations were honed into ideas that had genuine possibility. They became more cohesive and less focused on the effect to our personal individual bubbles. We began to understand different perspectives and relating issues. Again, this is back to being a super positive human. I genuinely believe that most people are good people who are willing to care about more than themselves. And if given an opportunity, will contribute positively to these things that affect more than themselves. If all you can see, though, is your own perspective, then that is all you'll draw on. That's all you'll consider. And you don't know what you don't know. You know, so if you're entering a conversation about these divisive issues, you will, as a human, you will draw on what you know. But through these processes, we begin to understand different perspectives and relating issues. And they informed and they educated and they resulted in realistic recommendations. We started the most recent activity. We started off with people having visions of skylines and flying cars and all kinds of wonderful things like this. But in the end, surprisingly, there were no flying cars in any of the recommendations. Thirdly, informed conversations encourage healthy debate without emotionally charged argument. The issues we discussed, transport and public health, are divisive, and people feel strongly about them. I fully expected there to be wild disagreements and arguments, and was impressed by how many people from such different backgrounds and different experiences and often disparate needs came together and engaged with questions in a constructive way. There was disagreement, but there was space to broaden our minds and reach consensus together. And there was, even though we'd never met before, a real sense of community. After one session together, we were in it together, and we were really willing to do the hard work to produce something that was going to be beneficial. No one was there to, I think someone earlier said, like, win for their side. That's not what it ended up being at all. And I'll be honest, I kind of expected that's what it was going to be. But I think on a whole, people want to do the work and they want to contribute meaningfully. And that's what this gives people like me an opportunity to do. And lastly, and I think most importantly from my perspective, the value of these opportunities went beyond the questions at hand. I personally don't like discussing issues which I feel I don't know enough about. And so then I will sit out of conversations of importance because I feel like I don't know enough to contribute meaningfully or to have a meaningful opinion. So I just won't have one. With these experiences, I came away feeling much more informed with a wider view of the issues that encompass many different perspectives. I understood policy process better. I understood the views of the different stakeholders better. I even was introduced to stakeholders I never would have even thought of in regard to the questions at hand. I became away enthusiastic about the subjects, and I talked to friends and family and colleagues and sparked conversations about transportation and community health just about everywhere I went. And I feel like the more people involved in an informed discussion, instead of debating or arguing from a limited viewpoint, the easier it will be for policymakers to shape policy in such a way as to positively affect the most people possible, because they'll better understand the needs and perspectives of the populace. If the general population feels heard and seen, they will engage with policy in a more positive way. And I actually think many will have more grace for decisions that may not bring them personally the most benefit, because they better understand the benefit overall. Instead of feeling the establishment is the enemy and is the problem, they feel part of the solution. And you'll get greater buy-in and more commitment to any policy change if people feel like they understand why it's happening and how it will affect the world in general. So how can deliberative democracy support effective and just climate policy? I believe that by engaging citizens in informed discussions, deliberative processes can lead to better informed decision-making, more effective policy solutions, and improved policy outcomes. The processes can foster also a more engaged citizenry and help build stronger communities, increasing civic engagement and greater trust in the institutions involved. That is, of course, my perspective, and others may have different ones, but I hope that's been helpful.
Christina, and thanks to all the speakers. They were really fantastic presentations from all of you. I've learned a lot, been very stimulating. Thank you. I'd like to pick up on something that Christina just said, actually, which really resonates with my experience of observing processes like citizens' assemblies, about creating this space for people to have an opportunity to learn and contribute. And I think you put it really nicely, that people are given more grace for decisions that don't necessarily bring them kind of personal benefit, but they understand the contribution to the greater good. And I found it really humbling to see people kind of rolling up their sleeves in a deliberative process and really apply themselves to finding solutions that work for the greater good. So yes, thank you all. Could I invite the panelists to come and sit up here, please? And I think magically this screen will be turned off when you do, so you don't, and in a moment I'd like to open the floor for Q&A from everybody. I was going to ask one question, but I feel like it might take you all quite a long time to answer it, so perhaps since we don't have that much time left, I will forego that privilege and invite people in the room to put questions to our panelists if they would like to. Jessie, there's a question at the front here. And could I ask you all to use the microphones when you want to say anything? Yep.
Yes, I could think of several questions, but I'll go with the hardest one. How could we integrate deliberative processes into ongoing decision making? I've noticed, we have done studies of public consultation, they all tend to be short term, produce a result. It may be quite often you don't even get any feedback, but sometimes you're way up Arnstein's ladder and everyone agrees in the end where to put a sewage work in North Down Borough Council. But with climate change, it's not just a one-off thing. What are the ways you think we could do it? I mean, in Ireland, councils actually have ongoing committees of citizens working with them. They don't end. in Milan, they've had, when they absorbed all the towns near to them, they set up a community network to integrate all of those. But given our political system, how would you actually get it so that the deliberation integrates with decision making?
Okay. Would anyone like to actually, before you do, I'm going to suggest we take 2 questions at a time and then come back. And who else would like to ask a question? On the back row there, on the right. So that hand first.
Hi, thank you. Perhaps a slight follow-up question to David's one. Lucy was sort of really interested in your arguments that we perhaps don't need more citizens' assemblies. We need citizens having direct input into process. And perhaps this also echoes what you were saying, Kris, that it doesn't just want to feel for show. You want to feel that it's sort of being listened to and acted on. So just wondering, I guess for the whole panel, but perhaps particularly Lucy, if you would sort of be arguing for sortition, where you do have a random selection of citizens who aren't just making policy recommendations, but are legislating on it. I remember that was one of Extinction Rebellion's asks, and a lot of people felt that that was far too radical. That is not how democracy works in the UK. But interesting hearing like, okay, we've done enough of the deliberative policy. So yeah, would love people's thoughts.
Thank you. And let's take one more question and then we'll let you answer what you like. The gentleman in the hat there.
Hi, I really enjoyed that. That was very informative from all of you. I feel like I was thinking the whole time about the limits of this deliberative democracy. You know, I really believe in democracy, but I think about in what instances are maybe technocratic decision making more effective. And I'm curious to hear your opinions on that. I come from like a wildlife sciences background from the United States. And in a lot of cases, the wildlife officials are sort of supposed to make the decisions for the people because maybe like it's thought that they know best, right? I think in a lot of instances when it comes to wildlife sciences, there's a lot of emotion behind a lot of the decisions. You know, most people, like maybe for instance, don't even want to think about hunting, but we use that regularly for wildlife control and such. And so I'm imagining instances in which you would sort of put people tasked with the responsibility of making these decisions that potentially like they might not be best suited to make. So my question is, I'll just actually hone in a little bit here. I'm curious specifically about like when you're making these more controversial decisions, do you bring speakers from both sides into the discussions, or do you sort of more directly like address a point by having like speakers from one side of the argument come in? And like how much bias do you think is present in these discussions or from these speakers? You know, I'm sort of a lot of questions there, but I'm wondering about the limits, you know, in those ways, and when maybe technocratic decisions are more important, or yeah, sure. things of that nature. So
great question, thank you very much.
I'd like to I'll respond to the first and the last question, and then you know, I think Lucy might also want to come in on the second one. Okay, yeah. Great, that's good. And then let's sort of see where we get to. So with the sort of integration of deliberative processes into decision making, that requires us to understand where the decisions are being taken and at what level, what kind of decisions they are. Assuming they are institutional decisions about policy or implementation of policy, then obviously the political process, civil service decision making as well, and the sort of interactions at the global level, multilateral institutions like the UN and COP, and the decision making processes of the member states are ways to do the integration. But in a way, one of the big challenges is it's not always necessarily that clear where the decisions are being taken. So that's an important point to make, or who is responsible for making a decision. And that's a big challenge for something like this in terms of being able to embed itself within democratic and political processes. I can sort of speak to 2 examples where I think this has done quite a fairly good, I mean, this has been done quite well. The Danish Board of Technology was a initiative that integrated consensus conferences, so similar to deliberative in public, into their decision making, so the Danish Parliament's decision making about emerging science and technology issues. So any major legislation or regulation that had to be passed around, I don't know, bioethics or the future of technology or genome editing, first had to go through a deliberative process that then went back into the political ecosystem. To date, I think that's one of the very few examples of institutionalization, but there are other, and then other examples of institutionalization that are quite interesting are kind of, calls drawing on the Belgian experience for what are being described the House of Citizens instead of an elected House of Lords. So there's the suggestion that the approaches can be integrated in the decision-making chamber of political organizations. That's the answer to that question. And the answer to the question about like whether adversarial views should be represented or not in a deliberative process is really interesting, because arguably one of the points of convening around an issue such as assisted dying or abortion are that these are really kind of complex and nuanced issues, and actually they've been unnecessarily polarized. So one of the things that you're trying to do is to integrate a range of and a plurality of views and perspectives as a form of evidence. And so arguably you don't want to replicate the sort of pros and the cons and that polarity within the design and within the structure of a deliberation, although it has been done. So, I mean, I've seen deliberative processes where it's been for a particular issue that's contested and controversial, and again, because that often mirrors a sort of jury style deliberation. I'm not sure it's always necessarily that helpful, but that's just a personal take. I'll be interested to hear what other people have to say about that.
On that last, comment you're making, and this obviously comes from my limited experience of two of these exercises. The most recent one, we had people coming in, this was about transport and public health. We had people coming in from like the bus companies and the council and all of these people, but then we also had small business owners and community groups, and they came at the same subject from very different perspectives and had very different views on any suggested solution. So they weren't pros and cons, but it was certainly different aspects, different perceptions of the same issue. And I think that was very, very valuable. I think if they only brought to us everyone who had the same thing to say about the same subject, it would have been a useless exercise. But we were able to see how something as basic as like the LTNs in Oxford, this person was like, this is very great. I can walk down my street, my children, it feels healthier. And then a small business company was saying, yeah, but we've lost our business and we're closing down. So they were different views on the same subject, not contrasting, but certainly different. And that made the exercise invaluable, I think.
I'll speak to your question on sortition. I guess one last point on that. One of the things that I think is interesting is to differentiate the idea of public opinion and public judgment. And so public opinion, as we measure in opinion polls, if we think about issues like assisted dying, those are often very polarized. What I find is that you rarely get the same level of polarization in a deliberative process. And I think that's because public opinion, the way we react to something we read in the newspaper, something that we see as a kind of proposition, is often quite different than our sort of our judgment about it. And that's to me where deliberation can help us to sort of bridge that gap in polarity in what seem to be very polarized conversations. To the question around, do I think we should use sortition to kind of replace elected representatives? That's a good. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think I mean, Reema's given some examples of systems where of ways in which that's being trialed, and I think are really interesting. I'm in some ways less interested in reforming our political institutions and structures than in reforming our political culture. I think a world in which we had more deliberative conversations in our politics would be one in which we would achieve better outcomes. In your introduction, Alan, you talked about the idea of this, the kind of debate. When I teach deliberative theory, I start from this perspective of imagine you're in the House of Commons and that you and I are MPs. We can have an entire exchange, but one right honourable member to the other, without either of us actually taking any meaning from the other person's statements. We are purely there to have a formalized, ritualized exchange. And I think that for me, that sort of exemplifies the way in which our political culture is the opposite of a deliberative one. And so, yes, I think there are ways in which, like, the role of sortition for me, sortition is a tool to ensure a diversity of perspectives. I don't personally attach the same kind of political value to it that some political theorists do. I'm much more interested in the idea of a deliberative culture in which decision making is just less adversarial. I don't know if you.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that. I mean, I would be stronger and say that sortition absolutely cannot replace election of representatives because people chosen through sortition are not accountable to the wider electorate. And we must have processes of accountability of people making decisions to the wider electorate, because if we don't have those processes, then the people who are making the decisions will be corrupted. And, you know, it's not that I worry that people like Kris are going to do bad things, but I do worry that people like me, the organizers of these processes, would start to be corrupted if these processes had too much power and if they were able to make decisions without accountability. So decision makers have to be accountable to the electorate, in my view, in the end. I really like what Reema said about institutionalization of these processes in response to your question, and so we've seen various ways in which citizens' assemblies and other deliberative processes have been embedded in decision-making processes beyond simply kind of making their recommendations and then hoping that somehow something will happen as a result. So, you know, for example, there have been a range of processes where members of citizens' assemblies have come back sometime after in order to review how the commissioning body has responded to the recommendations and respond further to that. So these kinds of institutionalization processes are really important. Fundamentally, however, the only way you will get these processes really to work and really to have an impact is if the wider political system believes in them. And if decision makers, either the decision makers themselves believe in these processes and commission the processes because they want to hear this kind of evidence. And, you know, there are some great examples of that in some local councils where the council has really been committed to listening deeply to what has come out of these processes. Or at least you have a situation where there is pressure from the media, pressure from the public to pay attention to the recommendations. So, you know, the first Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, for example, which produced recommendations on same-sex marriage and various other things, it was initially done because the politicians wanted to find something that made it look like they were listening in the wake of the financial crisis. But it began to build up momentum and build up steam, and it became hard for the recommendations to be ignored after that. Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say in response to your question as well. So again, I was really interested in what Reema was saying about community assemblies, and I think there are different kinds of assembly that we're talking about here. So a lot of these community assemblies are fantastic for building a movement around a cause, which is quite different from the kind of assembly that Kris was part of, which is around tackling a really divisive issue within a community, where it is crucial that you're bringing together the different perspectives and that you have a very carefully mediated process that will allow those different perspectives to be heard and respected. So, you know, if you're doing the kind of more of the sort of community building, community movement building process, then, you know, not so important that you have the full diversity of views within the room. Whereas if you're doing something like the Oxfordshire Citizens' Assembly, then it's incredibly important that you work very hard in order to ensure that the full range of perspectives is represented and everyone can feel that they have
been heard and had the chance to express their view.
No, okay. Thank you very much for your very thoughtful answers to the questions we've had. The Right Here, Right Now Global Summit is being co-hosted by the UN Human Rights, as well as Oxford University and some other partners. And we're very lucky to have Ben Schachter with us. Ben coordinates the Environment and Climate Change Unit at the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva. And before we wrap up, I'd like to invite Ben to come and make a few comments on what he's heard today during the discussion, and perhaps if you would care to link it to the summit more broadly.
So first of all, hello everybody, Ben Schachter. I'm with the United Nations Human Rights Office. As said, I am here in the context of our office, the UN Human Rights Office, co-hosting with the University of Oxford, the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit. And so over the last several days, I've been college shopping and forum shopping lots of very exciting events related to human rights, climate justice, and really impressed by all of the discussions that I've been able to join, and regretting that I couldn't join more of them. So a pleasure to be here. I think the first observation I want to share is having listened to all of these different reflections on deliberative democracy and different modalities and ideas and ways of making deliberative democracy work, deliberative discussions work. What I think everybody is talking about is the human right to free, active, meaningful participation and different ways of implementing that right. And also different ways that the implementation of this right facilitates more effective and better action, better policy making that makes sense for people on the planet. And so one thing I want to highlight is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one, as a process, is kind of interesting from this perspective, because it's a relatively unique process. It's a science policy platform. And what you have is scientists pull together, and it's basically all of them, all of the climate scientists in the world almost, pull together and draft an assessment, right? And massive report, thousands and thousands of pages. The ultimate output that most people see or hear of is called the Summary for Policymakers. And that Summary for Policymakers is negotiated by member states, which is a pretty weird thing to do with something that's meant to be a scientific report. But it's negotiated by member states with the scientists sitting there and able to push back and to say, actually, the language you want right here is not reflected in the science. And so they can be part of that process. And civil society organizations are there. And our office, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was there. And we spoke in those negotiations. We're not allowed to speak in all negotiations, which is a problem in and of itself, right? In terms of thinking about it. You have all this decision-making happening, and lots of times so-called observers are not allowed to directly participate. But what the IPCC found, and what made it into that Summary for Policymakers, that very top-line report, is that human rights-based approaches, participatory and inclusive approaches grounded in equity, they lead to more effective and sustainable outcomes. It's a very powerful finding, right? The science supports doing things this way. So not only are we talking about human rights obligations, all people have the right to public participation, have the right to be involved in decision-making about their fates, the very sort of, the slogan, nothing about us without us, right? That gets repeated in contexts all over the place, and absolutely correct. Not only are we talking about that, we're talking about something that just leads to better outcomes, In the context of the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit, one of the things we're trying to do is create that space for dialogue, and to do it in a very organic way, right? I mean, UN Human Rights was not involved in the organization of this event. We're very happy to be here. We're very happy that it's happening. But we have limited capacity, and we're very excited to see what University of Oxford and all of its colleges are doing with the idea of, hey, let's talk about human rights and climate justice. Let's talk about human rights and climate change. And it's not happening just here. It's happening at the University of South Pacific. It's happening at Monash and New South Wales universities in Australia. It's happening in the University of Cape Town and the University of Nairobi and the University of Sao Paulo, UC Boulder, the Himalayan University Coalition, University of West Indies. I may be missing some, and apologies to them. But the point is that this is actually part of a global discussion, bringing together indigenous peoples, environmental human rights defenders, social scientists, statisticians and artists and influencers. And that's part of having a more deliberative discussion. That's part of our objective. And we're also seeking to feed it into, and somebody mentioned the global mutirão, and my Brazilian colleague will probably, if she ever hears me having said that, be appalled, because I have no idea how to properly say it. But the COP30 presidency under Brazil has a vision of having something called a global ethical stocktake, of having a global mutirão, which brings together all of these different voices and gives them at least some additional window into the decision-making process at COP30. So one of the things we're doing, working with the University of Sao Paulo, is very much trying to connect this Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit and all of these discussions with that policy-making process, which is very challenging. I mean, I could talk for ages about COP30 and participation there, but I think I think we're past when this event should have concluded, and I've probably gone on too long. So the last thing I'll say is just like, please join us. The global plenary involving all those different universities from all around the world kicks off at 8 p.m. in the Sheldonian, which I think is just out that window. I don't know Oxford very well. It's my first time here. And so you can actually join us in person. You can register on the website, or you can join us on the live stream. And from 8 p.m. to hand off to University of South Pacific at 10 p.m., where it will be World Environment Day, which is tomorrow, we will have 24 hours of continuous live stream programming. And there's a lot more happening after that. It's all on the website. There's a wonderful part for the Oxford local program. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for allowing me the privilege of joining you here today, and really enjoyed the conversation.
And yes, it's time we wrapped up this afternoon. It's been so thought-provoking and stimulating and interesting. Thank you all for coming along, and thank you especially to our speakers for everything you've brought to it, and your energy and your insights. They've been marvellous. Would you like to join me in thanking the speakers